And as a result of you giving and giving, and in spite of your feelings, what happens is your love for that kid grows incredibly strong. Meanwhile, what happens when your spouse acts like a baby? What happens when your spouse is acting in a way that's immature and silly and awful, and you're called upon to continue to be loving to her or him in spite of how that person is acting? What do? You say, well, if she's not going to be the wife she used to be, what the heck do I have to be the husband I used to be? And you immediately start to say, since I don't like him, I don't have to love him. And then what happens is the less you love him, the less you like him, and the less you like him, the less you love him, and so on and so on. After 20 years, here you are doing the biblical kind of love to your kid, even though the kid's giving you nothing. And after 20 years, your kid could be an absolute jerk, and you love him. And in those same 20 years, you are operating in a completely selfish way with your spouse. And instead of continuing to serve, even when you don't like, you follow your feelings, you see. And you think, in other words, your love for your kid is biblical because it leads to affection. It's not affection. Essentially, it's service. Your love for your spouse, you think of it as basically an affection, and if the affection and the erotic feeling's not there, there's no reason to give. And as a result, the opposite thing is happening. Here, the more you love, the more you like. Here, the less you love, the less you like, and the less you like, the less you love. And after 20 years, no love between the spouses, lots of love between the parents and kids, even when the kids are rebellious and a mess and so on. And they look at me and they say, there's no love left in the marriage. No kidding. Because the way they define love isn't biblical. Love is meeting the needs and concerns of others before or instead of your own. Secondly, the opposite of love is not hate then, but fear. It says in 1 John 4:18, perfect love casts out fear. Maybe you thought the opposite of love is hate. Not biblically. The opposite of love is fear, because love is self-opening. Love is service. And whenever you serve somebody, you make yourself vulnerable. And take a look at the second Lewis quote up above, which is an amazing thing. Love anything, and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in a casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. The only alternative to tragedy, or at least to the risk of tragedy, is damnation. The only place outside heaven where you can be perfectly safe from all the dangers or perturbations of love, great word, is hell. The opposite of love is not hate but fear. Thirdly, the counterfeit of love we've already talked about. The counterfeit of love is the hunger. It's a need love. It's basically a manipulation and a way of using somebody. Lastly, how do you develop this in your life? Don't forget what we said in the beginning. We can wrap up like this. In the beginning we said the way to develop any kind of fruit of the Spirit is by looking at a particular attribute of God. In this case, it's the costly love of God. Ephesians 4:31-32 says, love one another as God in Christ forgave you. The cost. Look, when Jesus Christ was on the cross, we were told that God forsook him. Do you know what that cost? John Gerstner, one of my favorite preachers, retired man now, put it like this. He says, Jesus Christ says, I know this is kind of strong, but let me close with this illustration. Jesus Christ says, fear not him who can destroy your body, but fear him who can destroy body and soul in hell. Now, do you know what Jesus was saying? Jesus was talking to his disciples, and he knew that some of his disciples, in fact, all of them but John the Apostle, would be put to death in the most horrible ways. They would be crucified. But it gets worse. Some of his disciples were cut in half while they were still alive. Some of them had this hand and this leg tied to one horse, and this hand and this leg tied to another horse, and the horses go in that direction, and they were dismembered. Some people were put on, some of the disciples, I'm not sure the apostles, but some of the disciples that Jesus was talking to were covered with pitch and then impaled on a stake right up here, right through their body while they're still alive, and then lit as torches in the Roman circus. Some of the disciples had little holes drilled in the top of their head, and while they're still alive, molten lead poured into them. And Jesus has the audacity to say, that's nothing compared to hell. And then we know this. Jesus Christ took all of our hells. Now that must have been pretty amazing, because he did it all. He paid everything that we ever could have paid for our sin in 3 hours. So it's got to be far worse than anything that any one individual could have ever suffered, even if you've gone to hell. And then it was all compressed into 3 hours, and all of our punishments on top of them at one time. And Jesus Christ was up there looking not just at the people at his feet, but everybody in this room. And in the greatest act of love in the history of the world, he stayed. Now you look at that, and you will become a loving person. And there's no other sight that